my subject is Life as Habit or Addiction. It's a conceptual work where I try to combine many different fields from philosophy, for example, philosophy of biology, ethics, and many other fields to define life as a kind of habit or even addiction. As I wrote in my abstract, I didn't read anything from Spengler before. Before this call for papers, I just knew very well that he wrote The Decline of the West. I just knew very few things from secondary literature. But when I saw the call, I decided to look more into him, and especially on his book Man and Techniques. And while reading it, I understood that I might use it as a chapter of my dissertation, my thesis, because the way he uses or defines techniques might as well be of use of me for the way I try to define habits. So I'm here more like to learn things about him than to say something very new to you, because I guess most of you are more familiar with him. So I just try to present the book, Man and Techniques, a contribution to a philosophy of life, while making some comments about where and how I find that techniques or anything that he says is relevant to what might be a literature concerning habits. So as I said, what I find absolutely relevant when thought further about is that Spengler's techniques can be parallel to what I try to define as habit. Techniques is, he says, the tactics of living. So habit might as well be defined very well as the tactics of living. Men are never men in themselves. They are born into specific time, place, race, etc. As he says, therefore they have specific techniques or habits, to which habits they persist to the point of obsession or addiction to them. Their will is their will to own them, to own life, to own their habits, each of them their specific techniques and habits, and therefore to own first of all their because they are too, as I quote, too shallow and cowardly to endure the fact of the mortality of everything living, end of quote. This condition of mortality forces them as a response to it to cling onto life to the point of obsessing with it, obsessing to the state or the process of being alive. The whole of the animal world has techniques, Spengler calls it the generic technique, but only the human develops his techniques further than the generic level. This is probably due to his consciousness of mortality, among other factors, such as his intellectual disposition towards new techniques. Both in primitive cultures and in civilization, to which Spengler is very suspicious, the goals stay the same, the handling of our mortality. This is our obsession that ever invents new ways, which is new habits, techniques to fulfill itself. We aim at persevering ourselves to the now of life, an obsession to persist and to be and continue to be ontologically the same, which is to continue on living. Techniques is distinctive of the animal, as he says, in contrast to the plant-wise. And the life of the animal is a struggle and a conflict. It is dependent on the tactics of its living, which is the techniques, whether the animal will shape its own history or the history of the other, animate or inanimate, or the history of the other, the animate or inanimate, will shape his life of the animal, as Spengler observes. What is important, and Spengler makes a note of it, is that one shall not focus on the techniques as implements of things, as people mistakenly do in the study of prehistory, for example, where they focus on artifacts rather than on processes, but as purposive activities. There are even techniques that require and use no implements or things at all. In other words, what counts as techniques is what contributes to a specific thought, goal, or idea. Contrastingly to historical materialism, Spengler believes that first comes the thought or the idea and then the tools or the techniques. And he said, I quote, he says, every machine serves one process and owes its existence to thought about this process, end of quote. The human's mode of thinking and being oriented towards goals brings man to the thought and the consciousness of the ending of everything, including his life and life in general, that is impermanence and mortality. The human is like the Nietzschean mosquito in the theory of the purpose of life, Nietzsche's book, that flies in optimism and full will to power, although in complete vanity, when putting aside his mortality and when forgetting, as philosophers do, and Spengler makes a note about it, that he is no human in himself, but only a human of a time, of a locality, of a race, of a personal caste. And that's all of his destiny, which is the destiny of his specific tactics of living or his specific techniques or habits. These are the habits that he's going to persist upon obsessively, the human, and make it his goal to preserve, for they are his only humanity in a way, because they are his destiny, which is the only actual goal and realistic end of his struggle and his combat, that is of his life itself. Therefore, this addiction to life is the obsession with a specific general or specific to each being habits or techniques. Different destiny means different ethics, and different ethics mean different tactics of life, which is different habits. For example, as Spengler says, it is a different destiny when it comes to the herbivore and another one when it comes to the carnivore, where at the latter he places the man too. We can annihilate life, he says, but we cannot alter it in kind, which means that each life, which is the life of each kind of being, has a specific inward form, meaning and tactics. But life in general, I would add, has also specific characteristics attributable to all the living that have life, or all the beings that have life, and which can be annihilated if life itself is annihilated, but cannot be altered. I found the core characteristic of life in general and of life itself to be the addiction to it. This addiction to life shapes a destiny for the living, which means an ethics, which in turn shapes tactics and habits of life and living. Two examples of tactics that Spengler attributes to the carnivore are the tactics of movement and the tactics of each organ of sense. In the case of the carnivore, the tactics of the eye. The herbivore, which is the defensive animal, the prey, employs the tactics of the ear and the scent, while the animal of prey, the carnivore, employs the eye. The eye has offensive tactics. It has a target, which is the prey, the fixation to possess, to own whatever it fixates upon, and turn it to its prey or victim, and in general to its property. Therefore, as a category of the tactics of the eye is a tactic or the habit of property or of ownership. In a way, we could say that I own, therefore I exist, or I exist because I own, because of my tactics or habits to own or to possess. With this tactic come together the tactics of dominance, commanding, sovereignty, power, feeling of freedom and of superiority. The root of the idea of the property, as Spengler writes, or the tactic of the property, as I would say it, comes from the fact that the carnivore does not need a herd to protect itself, because it has individual power, the power given by the tactics of the eye. Therefore, it needs and tolerates, as Spengler says, no equal in his den. And I quote again from Spengler, who says that property is a domain in which one exercises unlimited power, the power that one has gained in battling, defended against one's peers, victoriously upheld. It is not a right to mere having, but the sovereign right to do as one will with one's own. As I already have mentioned, the whole of the animal world has techniques, which is the generic technique in Spengler's words, but only the human develops his techniques further than the generic level. The generic technique will be equivalent to something like a generic habit, as I will use it in my vocabulary, or a generic ethos, to be more in line with ethology, which is the study of animal behaviors. So the generic habit or ethos is a property of each species. It has a biological basis subscribed to each species. And here I can mention that Spengler is considered to be a kind of precursor for the field of sociobiology, which is still very relevant in the scientific realm. Animals, apart from the humans, Spengler says, have only generic techniques. This is doubtable, though, but not of the present moment to debate, because in ethology we see that specific animals develop specific techniques or habits as well. The generic habits are unchangeable because they are habits of life itself. Generic habits are compulsive, are, as Spengler says, a compulsion of the genus. However, humans' techniques or habits, the ones not attached to his genus, but the ones he invents consciously, he learns and he improves. The eye of the beast regards the world theoretically. And then comes, in the case of the human, the hand, which commands it practically. Hand and tool go together, and as Spengler says, they constitute his liberation from the compulsion of the genus. The compulsion of the genus is the compulsion towards the generic technique of the eye and the thought of the eye, which in the human has developed the thought that is theoretical, observant, contemplative, which is our reflection and wisdom. With the human hand simultaneously comes the tool and automatically the thought of the hand, which is the practical, active thought, or as Spengler says, our cunning and intelligence proper. The eye is far behind and imbecilic, as he says, in seeking cause and effect, in staying a mere observer and in searching for a truth, while the hand quote, works on the principle of means and end of quote. It is a doer and seeks for facts. He first, with the eye, sees, which is cause and effect, related to cause and effect, how things are done in nature, and then because of the hand tool, he thinks out a process of creating them by himself. The most obvious example for this is fire. And he says that the act of the thinking hand will be called a deed. Ideals are coarties, as Spengler writes, but I will add that ideals are employed or are the refugee when tactics are missing or are not capable of being employed. Ideals, in other words, substitute, or rather are the illusionary substitutes of tactics or habits. Genus, Spengler says, is a form not of the visible and static, but of mobility, a form not of so being, but of so doing. Bodily form is the form of the active body. And here one can refer to the distinction Spengler does of the systematic and the physiognomic, which is the organic, the one that has destiny in the decline of the West. The hand is at the same time the tool and the weapon, and it is what renders the humans creative. Thus they escape the limits of their genus, and they enrich life, creating the concept of a world history and of humanity itself. The tools that the beasts use are natural, while man creates artificial ones, and here begins, he says, art as a counter-concept to nature. Every technical process of man is an art. This is, Spengler says, the history of a rebel that grows up to raise his hand against his mother. And here I will begin to talk more about his so-called environmentalist thought, because he was one of the very first to talk about the environmental destruction. The thought of the hand calls for the practical need for the medium of speech or language and simultaneously of enterprise. This is a change, as pre-mentioned, not of objects, artifacts, implements, or equipment, as archaeologists and museums mistakenly think, but of humans' techniques or habits, namely of what the human does with them. So at the beginning the human was employing his techniques solitarily, each of them, but then from the personal tools we move to the common enterprise, which involves an immensely increased artificiality of procedure. The mutation of the human is due to the fact that the human wants to break free even further from the compulsion of the genus, which is the generic technique, and to extend the limits of his body even more. Tragically, in doing so, however, he becomes a slave of his thought. Maybe the primary thought he develops is the thought of procreation. From this originates the idea of cultivation of both plants and animals, therefore of agriculture and breeding, and which is the so-called Neolithic revolution. The human's ownership extends outside his body to what he procreates, which is his plants and the livestock, and the land or the place they occupy, so he defends them as he defends his body. The prey beast, although he wants to break free from the compulsion of the genus, he still repeats the same compulsion with his territory, albeit this time this territory is artificially extended. Namely, it is not a territory provided by nature, as is his body, but a territory provided artificially by his new thoughts and his acts or techniques. Intellectuality might not grasp the truth, but its working hypothesis, and he himself is calling them working hypotheses, work appropriately in order to force nature to obey. The machine is the subtlest, he says, of all possible weapons against nature. I continue the quote. Entrepreneurs and inventors have in principle devoted the number of hands that they needed to each production, the working of the machine being done by inorganic force. End of quote. Work has become a curse because the machine has ended the sense of camaraderie between the workers. They no longer understand what is the purpose of their work, because they are merely hands. The intellectual is used by the ones guiding them. So, and to end, I will make some further comments on how Spengler looks on culture and history in general. And as he says, history is one consequence of efforts to get the decision of whether to follow the blood, which is the beast of prey, or whether to follow the artificiality and intellectuality of culture. And he also says that every high culture is a tragedy, and the history of mankind as a whole is tragic. And this is because the sacrilege and the catastrophe of the Faustian are greater than all others, greater than anything Aeschylus or Shakespeare ever imagined. The mechanization, I still quote from Spengler, that the mechanization of the world has entered on a phase of highly dangerous overtension. The picture of the earth with its plants, animals, and men has altered. End of quote. So the Faustian human is now turning against the machine and towards nature, along with the non-Faustian cultures, to whom the Faustian machine imposed itself, and who are turning against the Faustian cultures in general. And this will be the last act, or the fall of the Faustian culture. In my words, cultural artificial habits were a Faustian ambition of the human to overcome the natural habits, and thus to create himself anew, independent from the compulsion of his nature and of nature in general. But in doing so, he enslaved himself in the artificial chains of his own creations, which are the machine habits, and in turn through their compulsions, which have become his own. what mostly man wants to break free from is what he feels deeply as the compulsion of life itself. But by inventing new habits all the time, what he merely accomplishes is to feed his addiction to life, and in particular the life of the genus, and the life of himself with new habits over and over again.